There are secrets that cling to the shadows, desperate to be told. We drag them into the light. Welcome to Gravevale Echoes. They say the sea keeps the darkest secrets. For one archaeologist guided by a forgotten map, a legendary treasure found on a stormy Cornish beach will unleash an ancestral curse, proving that some things are better left lost in the tides. There are men who are haunted by ghosts, and then there are men who are haunted by ideas. Dr. Alistair Finch was a man of the latter persuasion, though he was beginning to suspect the two were not so different after all. His ghost was a legend, a story whispered in the smoky pubs and quiet, sea-facing cottages of the Cornish coast. It was the story of the Golightly family, and more importantly, the story of their lost treasure. Alistair had once been a respected archaeologist, a man with a promising career at a prestigious university. But his methods had become unorthodox. While his colleagues were content to excavate Roman villas and catalog pottery shards, Alistair had been drawn to the fog-shrouded line where history bleeds into folklore. He began chasing local legends, convinced that the most persistent myths were simply distorted memories of historical fact. His obsession became the Golightly clan, a notorious family of smugglers and wreckers who had terrorized the Cornish coast in the 17th century. They were said to be as cruel as the winter sea and as cunning as the devil himself, amassing a fortune in stolen goods and plundered gold. Then, one day, they had simply vanished. The family, their ship, and their legendary treasure were swallowed by the sea during a hurricane of unprecedented fury. Or so the official story went. But the legend, the story that had cost Alistair his career and his reputation, told a different tale. It whispered that the family had not been lost, but had been cursed, dragged down to the depths by the spirits of the sailors they had drowned. And their treasure, a magnificent crown cobbled together from stolen jewels and melted down church gold, had been cursed along with them. Alistair was not a treasure hunter in the conventional sense. He didn't care for the gold itself. He sought validation. He sought the one, tangible piece of evidence that would prove his theories were not the ramblings of a madman. He sought the Golightly crown. For 5 years, he had lived in a small, damp cottage on the coast, a pariah in the academic world, poring over brittle shipping manifests, deciphering cryptic entries in old church Bibles, and cross-referencing sailors' drunken tales. He was chasing a ghost story, and everyone knew it. They called him Finch's Folly, the scholar who had drowned his career in a sea of myth. After years of dead ends and frustrating whispers, he had finally found it. Not the crown itself, but the key. It wasn't a single document, but a collection of disparate, maddeningly vague clues that, when pieced together, formed a kind of map. A line in a forgotten poem spoke of a cove where the sea devils screamed. An entry in a smuggler's diary mentioned a king's ransom hidden where the winter tide reveals the bones of the earth. A faint, almost invisible annotation on an old nautical chart marked a treacherous stretch of coastline with a tiny, hand-drawn crown and a single cryptic phrase, "Only when the storm king rages." He had assembled the puzzle. The clues all pointed to one place. A remote, jagged cove known to locals as the Widow's Maw. A place so dangerous that no fisherman would dare approach it. And they all pointed to one time. The night of the winter solstice, during a full gale, at the moment of the year's lowest astronomical tide. It was a confluence of events so specific and so dangerous that it seemed designed by a madman to protect a secret. Or perhaps by a curse. Tonight was that night. The storm was a living, breathing monster. Alistair stood on the cliff edge overlooking the cove, the wind tearing at him with physical force, a relentless, shrieking assault that threatened to rip him from his footing and hurl him into the chaos below. The sky was a churning cauldron of black and bruised purple clouds, occasionally lit by a flash of distant, silent lightning. The sea was a nightmare. It was a heaving, boiling mass of black water, its surface ripped into mountains and valleys. Great white-maned waves, born of the storm's fury, hurled themselves against the cliffs with a sound like cannon fire, a deafening, thunderous roar that was less a sound and more a vibration that shuddered up through the soles of his boots and into his very bones. Dressed in oilskins, his face raw from the wind and stinging salt spray, Alistair began his treacherous descent down the narrow, winding path cut into the cliff face. The rock was slick with rain and sea spray, and he had to cling to the cliff with numb fingers, his feet searching for purchase in the dark. Below him, the cove known as the Widow's Maw lived up to its name. It was a semicircle of jagged, tooth-like rocks that seemed designed to catch and tear apart any ship unlucky enough to be driven into them. The wind howled and screamed as it was funneled between these rocky spires, creating a symphony of tormented, human-like wails. It truly sounded as if the devils of the sea were screaming in agony. He finally reached the small, crescent-shaped beach at the bottom. It was a battlefield. The tide was unnaturally low, lower than he had ever seen it, exposing a wide expanse of wet, black sand littered with the debris of the storm. tangled masses of dark green kelp, splintered driftwood, and the ghostly white shells of dead things. The waves still crashed at the edge of the sand with a terrifying hunger, but the map of the cove was laid bare. He pulled a small, shielded lantern from his pack, its weak, yellow flame a tiny, fragile spark in the immense, raging darkness. He consulted the tattered fragments of his map, his hands shaking from cold and adrenaline. The final clue was a simple drawing, a rock formation that looked like a great stone hand reaching out of the sea. He scanned the cove, his lantern beam cutting through the gloom, and there it was. At the far end of the beach, a cluster of rocks perfectly matched the drawing, its tallest spire like a pointing, accusatory finger. He scrambled over the slippery, seaweed-covered rocks, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. This was it, the culmination of 5 years of obsession, of ridicule, of lonely, maddening work. He was either about to be proven a genius or a complete and utter fool. The tide was at its absolute lowest point, a brief, fragile ebb that would last only minutes before the sea came roaring back to reclaim its territory. He had to be quick. He reached the rock formation. The space between the stone fingers was a narrow crevice, choked with a thick, dark mat of seaweed and black sand, a place that would normally be deep underwater. It was exactly as the legends had described. This was where the sea revealed the bones of the earth. He fell to his knees, ignoring the icy water that soaked through his trousers, and began to tear at the thick, rubbery kelp with his bare hands. He dug frantically, his fingers raw, pulling away handfuls of the slimy, stinking weed. For a moment, he found nothing but more sand and smooth, worn stones. A cold wave of despair washed over him. Had it all been for nothing? Was he truly just Finch's Folly, a madman kneeling in a storm, chasing a child's ghost story? And then his fingers hit something hard. It was not a rock. It was too smooth, too regular. As he cleared away the last of the sand, his lantern light fell upon it. A faint, unnatural glint of gold. His breath caught in his throat. It was real. He worked faster, his movements feverish, scraping away the remaining sand and kelp. More of it was revealed. A curved band of dark, heavy metal, studded with something dull and smooth. He did not need to see all of it. He knew what it was. After all these years, after all the doubt and ridicule, it was here, hidden in this godforsaken cove, guarded by a hurricane. The Golightly crown. The beckoning light of the legend had not been a lie. It was here, in the dark, just waiting for the one man stubborn and mad enough to come and find it. And as he stared down at his prize, the roar of the sea and the howl of the storm seemed to fade into a low, expectant hum. The world held its breath. His obsession had been vindicated. He had found his ghost. And now all he had to do was reach out and take it. For a long, breathless moment, Alistair Finch simply knelt there in the freezing, ankle-deep water, his entire world shrinking to the small, dark crevice before him. The glint of gold was a lodestar in the maelstrom, a single point of impossible reality in a night of chaos. The years of ridicule, the lonely nights spent hunched over dusty books, the pitying looks from his former colleagues, all of it dissolved in the face of this single, undeniable fact. He had been right. He slowly raised his head, taking in the scene around him with a strange new clarity. The world felt different now, as if his discovery had fundamentally altered its fabric. The dominant sensation was the sound, the sheer, overwhelming power of the sea. The roar of the waves was not just a sound he heard with his ears. It was a physical force he felt in his chest, a deep, primal vibration that seemed to shake the very granite of the cliffs. It was a constant, thunderous assault, the sound of a vast, indifferent god clearing its throat. Each wave that crashed against the jagged rocks of the cove was a fresh explosion, sending plumes of white, atomized spray high into the air. A constant, chaotic battle between water and stone that had been raging for millennia and would continue long after he was gone. It was the sound of utter, impersonal power, and it made his own triumph, his own existence, feel terrifyingly small and fleeting. Then there was the wind. It was not just a breeze. It was a physical entity, a relentless, invisible assailant. It howled and shrieked as it tore through the rock formations of the Widow's Maw, a multitonal symphony of grief and rage. It was an ice-cold wind, born in the heart of the northern Atlantic, and it carried with it the sharp, stinging bite of salt. It whipped his oilskins against his body, found its way through the collar of his coat, and settled a deep, penetrating chill into his bones that no amount of exertion could warm. This was not the clean, brisk wind of a summer's day. It was a bitter, hostile wind that smelled of brine, of decay, and of immense, desolate loneliness. It felt like the breath of a resentful spirit, and it seemed determined to scour him from the face of the beach. He lowered his gaze again, back to the source of his obsession. The sheer, raw power of the storm made the object in the crevice seem even more significant, more defiant. He reached down and, with hands that shook from a combination of cold and ecstatic awe, he began to carefully excavate his prize. He cleared away the last of the wet, black sand and the tangled, rubbery strands of kelp, revealing the treasure in its entirety. There, nestled in its dark, watery bed, was the Golightly crown. Studded crudely into the band were the jewels. They were large, but their surfaces were dull and worn smooth by the ceaseless churning of the sea, their facets erased by centuries of abrasion. He could make out what might have been a ruby, now a dull, cloudy red stone, a sapphire, now a deep, almost black blue, and several large, milky pearls that had lost all their orient. They were dead jewels, their inner fire extinguished by the water, and yet the crown as a whole seemed to possess a light of its own. The moonlight from the storm-racked sky was fleeting, constantly obscured by the racing clouds. But even when the beach was plunged into near-total darkness, the crown maintained a faint, sickly, golden luminescence. It was not a reflection. It was an emission, a cold, internal glow that seemed to emanate from the very metal itself. It was the color of phosphorescence, of deep-sea decay, a light that did not illuminate but only served to emphasize the darkness surrounding it. It was a cursed light, and it made the object feel not just ancient, but unclean. As he stared at it, mesmerized, a strange phenomenon occurred. The immediate area around the crevice, a small circle perhaps 6 feet in diameter, seemed to fall preternaturally silent. It was impossible, and yet it was happening. The deafening roar of the sea did not stop, but it receded, softening to a distant, low hum, as if he were suddenly listening to it through a thick wall of glass. The howling, shrieking wind that had been assaulting him died away to a faint, almost inaudible whisper. The physical vibrations in the ground ceased. He was standing in a pocket of dead, expectant silence. The sudden absence of noise was more terrifying than the storm's fury had been. It was an unnatural silence, a vacuum where the world had been held back. It was as if the crown, now that it had been discovered, was exerting its own influence on the environment, creating a small, sacred, or perhaps profane, space around itself. The air in this bubble of silence grew thick and heavy, and the cold deepened, becoming a sharp, biting frost that had nothing to do with the wind. Alistair felt the tiny hairs on his arms and the back of his neck stand up. He was no longer just an archaeologist who had found an artifact. He was an intruder who had stumbled into a place that was not governed by the laws of his world. The stones of the cove, which had been witnesses to the storm's chaotic orchestra, now seemed to be listening. The silence was not empty. It was filled with a palpable, ancient awareness. He felt as though he were being watched, not by a person, but by the place itself, be the jagged rocks, the wet sand, and the deep, dark water. They were all holding their breath, waiting to see what he would do next. The cove had given up its secret, and now it was waiting for the consequence. Alistair looked from the silent, waiting stones back to the crown. It sat in its crevice, glowing with its sickly, cold light, the undisputed sovereign of this small, silent kingdom. All the legends he had studied flooded his mind. The tales of the curse, of the family dragged to their doom, of the treasure that brought ruin to any who touched it. He, a man of science and history, had dismissed them as sailors' superstitions, the fanciful embroidery on a tale of smugglers who had met a predictable end. But kneeling here, in this impossible bubble of silence, surrounded by the muted roar of a raging storm, staring at a golden crown that glowed with its own dead light, he was no longer so sure. The line between history and folklore, the line he had so eagerly sought to explore, was dissolving before his very eyes. He had found his proof, his validation. But he had the sudden, heart-stopping feeling that the legend was not just the story of the crown. The legend was the crown, and it was waiting for him. The silence pressed in, expectant, demanding a choice. He had found the forgotten treasure. Now, did he dare to claim it? The pocket of unnatural silence deepened, becoming a tangible pressure against Alistair's eardrums. The muted roar of the storm was now a distant, hypnotic hum, the sound of a world he was no longer fully a part of. Here, in this small, sacred circle on the edge of the sea, there was only the cold, the dark, and the sickly, phosphorescent glow of the Golightly crown. It was a moment suspended in time, the culmination of a life's obsession. The years of ridicule, the lonely pursuit, the scorn of his peer-sit had all led to this. His moment of triumph was here, resting in a shallow, watery grave at his feet. His mind, the rational, academic part of him that he had so long suppressed, screamed at him. It screamed of caution, of process. A discovery of this magnitude should be handled with meticulous care. It should be photographed, documented, its position mapped, its surroundings sifted for other artifacts. He should be wearing gloves, using tools, treating the site with the detached reverence of a scientist. To simply reach in and grab it was an act of archaeological sacrilege. It was the move of a treasure hunter, not a scholar. But the scholar in Alistair was dying. He had been dying for 5 years, starved by obsession. And in this moment, the treasure hunter, the man who needed not just to see but to possess his validation, finally took control. The lure of the crown was more than just the pull of history. It was a siren song, a hypnotic promise that holding it would make his entire broken, frustrating life worthwhile. The legends, the whispers of a curse, the palpable wrongness of the scene before him, all of it faded into insignificance, drowned out by the thunderous, desperate need to make it real. To hold it, his hand, chapped and red from the cold, began to move. It felt disconnected from him, as if it were acting on its own volition. It trembled violently, a betrayer to the calm facade he was trying to maintain. He watched, as if from a great distance, as his own fingers stretched out over the dark water pooling in the crevice, reaching down toward the glowing, twisted metal. He saw the reflection of his own pale, determined face in the murky water, a stranger staring up at him with wild, obsessive eyes. He was reaching into the past, into a legend, and he was about to pull it, kicking and screaming, into the present. The moment his fingertips made contact with the cold, wet metal of the crown, the world did not just change. It shattered. The cold was the first thing he felt. It was a coldness so absolute, so profound, that it defied all physical explanation. It was not the simple, honest chill of the sea or the wind. This was an ancient predatory cold, a cold that had been waiting in the abyss for centuries. It was the cold of the deepest, sunless trench of the ocean, the cold of a body that has been in the water for a very, very long time. It did not just touch his skin. It plunged into him like 1,000 tiny needles of ice. It shot up his arm, instantly numbing his hand, his wrist, his entire forearm. It bypassed his nerves and went straight for his soul, a horrifying violation that seemed to leach the very warmth and life force from his body. He tried to cry out, to pull his hand back, but it was as if the crown had already claimed him, its unnatural frost fusing his flesh to its cursed metal. And then came the whispers. They were not a sound he heard with his ears. They erupted directly inside his skull, a cacophonous, overlapping chorus of voices that was 1,000 times louder than the storm had ever been. There were men, their voices rough and guttural with anger. There were women, their voices sharp and filled with a venomous hatred. There were even the thin, reedy voices of children, twisted into something cruel and unholy. They all spoke at once, a torrent of spectral rage, but a single, repeated phrase cut through the chaos, spoken in an archaic Cornish dialect he only barely understood from his research. Who dares? Who dares disturb our rest? The sea claims its own. The sea will have its due. It was a psychic scream, an explosion of centuries of pent-up fury and resentment. They were the voices of the Golightly family, the guardians of the crown, and he had just broken into their watery tomb. He had disturbed their rest, and now they were demanding payment. His vision, which had been so sharply focused on the crown, dissolved into a gray, swirling mist. The stormy cove, the jagged rocks, the roaring sea all vanished. He was untethered from reality, adrift in a terrifying, sensory void. Then, out of the mist, a new scene began to form, not a memory, but a vision, a fragment of the past hurled into his mind with the force of a physical blow. He was no longer on the beach. He was on the deck of a ship. The wood beneath his feet was slick with rain and pitching violently, the mast groaning under the strain of a hurricane-force wind. The sky above was a terrifying, apocalyptic black. All around him were people, their faces stark white with terror in the flashes of lightning. He saw the cruel, sneering face of the Golightly patriarch, his arrogance finally broken, his eyes wide with disbelief as he clung to the ship's wheel. He saw the patriarch's wife, her fine dress torn, her hair a wild mat, screaming a silent, endless scream as a wall of black water rose up before the ship. He saw their 2 sons, no longer filled with youthful bravado, but with the pure, animal terror of impending death, their arms wrapped around each other as the ship began to break apart beneath them. He felt the bone-jarring impact as a colossal wave, a moving mountain of black water, crashed down upon the deck. He felt the splintering of wood, the rush of impossibly cold water, the final, collective scream of the Golightly family as the sea they had cheated and plundered for so long, finally rose up to claim its due. He felt their terror, their pain, and their final, furious, dying thought, a curse, spat into the storm, against the sea, against God, and against any soul who would ever dare to touch the source of their pride and their ruin, the crown. The vision lasted only a second, but it felt like an eternity. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. He was back on the beach, kneeling in the water, his hand still frozen to the crown. He gasped, sucking in a ragged breath of the cold, salty air, his heart hammering as if it were trying to escape his chest. The unnatural pocket of silence had been shattered. The full, furious roar of the storm crashed back in on him, a deafening wave of sound. He finally found the strength to rip his hand away from the crown. The feeling that returned to his arm was not a pleasant warmth, but a painful, tingling sensation, like 1,000 needles stabbing him from the inside out. He stumbled backwards, falling away from the crevice, his mind a scramble of disjointed images and echoing whispers. The vision of the sinking ship, the feel of the soul-deep cold, the sound of the spectral voice, it was all swirling within him, a poison that had already begun to infect his sanity. He had touched the Golightly crown, and now the Golightly curse had touched him back. Alistair scrambled backwards, his body moving on pure, primal instinct. He slipped on the wet, seaweed-covered rocks, his hands scraping against their sharp, barnacle-encrusted surfaces, but he felt no pain. The only sensation was the lingering, deathly cold in his right arm and the chaotic, screaming symphony of the curse replaying itself inside his skull. He finally found his footing on the wet sand and staggered away from the crevice, putting as much distance as he could between himself and the terrible, glowing artifact. He turned, his back to the cliffs, and faced the roaring, tumultuous sea, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The world had tilted on its axis. The solid ground of history and fact had given way to a terrifying, yawning abyss of supernatural horror. He was no longer triumphant. The ecstatic thrill of discovery had been scoured from his soul, replaced by a cold, penetrating dread that was far more profound than the simple chill of the storm. He had wanted proof, and he had gotten it. He had touched a legend and found it to be horrifyingly, tangibly real. As he stood there, trembling, trying to force his racing heart back into a normal rhythm, he realized that something was wrong. The quality of the light on the beach had changed. The moon, which had been playing a frantic game of hide-and-seek with the storm clouds, was now unobscured. A brilliant, cold, silver light flooded the cove, illuminating the scene with an unnatural clarity. But it wasn't just the moonlight. The very air itself seemed to be glowing, infused with a pale, spectral luminescence. The sea spray, whipped up by the wind, hung in the air not as a fine mist, but as a glittering, shimmering curtain of light. And he was no longer alone. Between him and the crashing, white-frothed waves, figures began to emerge. They did not walk out of the sea or coalesce from the air in a dramatic fashion. They simply appeared, as if they had been there all along, and the strange, new light was only now revealing them. They were formed from the very essence of the storm itself, from the pale moonlight, the shimmering sea spray, and the deepest, darkest shadows cast by the jagged rocks. They were translucent, their forms wavering and indistinct, the chaotic turmoil of the waves visible through their ghostly bodies. For of them, family, Alistair's blood ran cold. He didn't need to be told who they were. He had spent years studying the only known portrait of the Golightly family, a dark, severe painting that had hung in a local museum. He knew these faces, or rather, the spectral echoes of them. At the forefront stood the patriarch, Jedediah Golightly. Even as a phantom of mist and moonlight, his cruel arrogance was undiminished. A ghostly beard clung to a jaw set in a permanent sneer, and his eyes, two pits of deeper darkness, regarded Alistair with a cold, proprietary fury. This was his beach, his treasure, his curse, and Alistair was an unwelcome trespasser. To his right stood his wife, Elspeth. In the portrait, she had looked merely sad. As a spirit, her sadness was a palpable entity, a shroud of eternal grief that clung to her shimmering form. Her spectral face was a mask of unending sorrow, her gaze fixed not on Alistair, but on the raging sea, as if she were forever reliving the moment it had claimed her. She was a ghost not of anger, but of loss. And flanking them were their two sons, Thomas and Caleb. In life, they had been known for their reckless, cruel bravado. In death, that bravado had curdled into a cold, sullen rage. They were younger, their forms less defined, but their hatred was sharp and focused. They stared at Alistair with the pure, uncomplicated malevolence of predators whose territory had been invaded. They were the hounds of the curse, eager and waiting. They did not move. They did not speak, though the hateful whispers still echoed in the back of Alistair's mind. A constant, psychic torment. They simply stood there, a spectral barrier between him and the rest of the world, their collective presence a silent, soul-crushing judgment. They were the guardians, the jailers of the crown, and their very existence was a confirmation of the horror he had unleashed. The curse was not just an influence left on an object. It was an active, intelligent, and malevolent haunting. Then Jedediah Golightly, the patriarch, moved. He raised his right arm, a slow, deliberate gesture that commanded Alistair's complete attention. The arm was translucent, a thing of swirling mist, but the hand that it formed was surprisingly solid-looking. It was a cruel, grasping hand, and it leveled a single pointing finger. But the ghost was not pointing at the crown, which still lay in its crevice, pulsing with its sickly, golden light. He was not pointing at the sea from which he had been raised. He was pointing directly at Alistair's heart. It was an accusation, a judgment, a claiming. The gesture was unmistakable. You have touched what is ours. You have awakened us. And now you belong to us. A new wave of terror, sharper and more personal than any he had yet felt, pierced through Alistair. An involuntary instinct made him glance down at his own body, at his own right hand, the hand that had touched the crown. It was no longer just numb and cold. Something was happening to it. A dark, black mark was forming on the back of his hand, right on the spot where his skin had made contact with the cursed metal. It was not a bruise or a stain. It looked like a patch of frostbite, a creeping necrosis, the skin turning a dead, blackish gray. But it was spreading. Even as he watched, its edges seemed to crawl outwards in thin, spidery veins, like a drop of black ink blooming on porous paper. It was a living mark, a brand of ownership being etched into his very flesh. It was the mark of the curse. He stared at it, horrified, a strangled cry catching in his throat. He had read of such things in the most arcane and dismissed folklore: the devil's mark, the brand of a witch, a physical sign of a spiritual pact, a sign of damnation. The whispers in his head grew louder, more triumphant. Ours, marked as ours. The sea will have its due. He looked up again at the ghostly figures. Their spectral eyes were all fixed on the spreading black stain on his hand. A faint, horrifying shift occurred in the patriarch's misty features. The cruel sneer deepened, a silent expression of triumphant satisfaction. Their work was done. The trap had been sprung. The curse had found a new host, a new anchor to the world of the living. With their judgment passed and their mark delivered, their forms began to fade. They did not retreat into the sea or vanish in a flash. They simply dissolved, their misty bodies unraveling and becoming one with the churning sea spray and the cold moonlight, their substance returning to the storm from which it had been born. Within moments they were gone. Alistair was alone on the beach once more. But everything was different. The ghosts were gone, but their presence remained, an indelible stain on the air. The whispers in his head had subsided back to a low, constant murmur, a promise of torment to come. And the black, spreading mark on his hand was a cold, undeniable reality. He had found his treasure. He had proven his legend true. But in doing so, he had taken the place of the Golightly family. He had become the guardian of the crown, the jailer of the curse, or perhaps its newest prisoner. The storm still raged, the sea still roared, but Alistair Finch no longer heard it. All he could feel was the soul-deep cold in his arm and the burning, spreading blackness of the mark that had sealed his fate. Alistair has found his treasure, but at a terrible price. He is now bound to the Golightly family, marked by a curse born of a watery grave. The ghosts have faded, but the whispers and the mark remain. What will the curse do to him? And where does an ancestral curse like this truly come from? Share your thoughts below.